Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. Today's video is the first of a two-parter about society in the 1920s in the United States. This is going to be the more fun of the two videos, talking about the Jazz Age. The Jazz Age was a phrase coined by author F. Scott Fitzgerald to describe the rapidly changing, advancing urban culture of the 1920s, and that encompasses consumer goods and entertainment and pop culture and music and all of that. So with that in mind, let's get started talking about all that stuff. This was a time of great change in America. These changes began in the late 19th century with the increased urbanization of America. And if you're one of my students, we've talked about that at length, the movement of people to the cities en masse. 1920, when that census was completed, that was the first time that more people in America lived in cities than lived in more rural areas. It was also found in the 1920 census that 75% of people in America didn't work on a farm. So that's also a big change. You see this, big shift from the agrarian, more rural, pastoral society to being an urban society. And so things are going to be faster and things are going to advance along with changes in technology and stuff like that. So this shift from rural to urban is what really drives a lot of what we think of as being the quote-unquote roaring 20s. So what does that entail? First of all, it means consumerism. There's a lot of new technology available to people in the 1920s, and because of the booming economy, average everyday Americans are able to purchase these things and make their lives a lot easier. The electric refrigerator comes about in the 1920s, making it easier to keep food fresh. Vacuum cleaners, which makes cleaning much easier and faster. The automatic washing machine eliminates the need to set aside an entire day to wash a bunch of clothes by hand. Now it can be done very quickly and much more efficiently. And automobiles become much bigger in the 20s as well. Automobiles aren't technically a home appliance, but they do fit in with these other things in that all of these items that are listed there give people more leisure time. And that's going to contribute to there being more of a pop culture as well. People aren't working all the time. People aren't spending all their time traveling to and from work or then doing things around the home. They're able to do fun stuff now as well. Automobiles become more of a status symbol in the 1920s, whereas before they were just something you needed to get where you were going. The Model T, which came about in 1908 from Ford, was incredibly Spartan. They were all the same. Henry Ford once famously said you could get the Model T in any color you wanted as long as you wanted black. But the Model A, which was the next automobile produced by Ford that came out in 1927, came in multiple colors, and it looks a little more flashy. You see the picture of that one there. That one's red, but they came in a lot of different colors, and a lot of other car companies pop up in America and in Europe, and the wealthiest of Americans would often import cars from Europe. I think Jay Gatsby in The Great Gatsby drove a yellow Rolls Royce, if I'm not mistaken. The advance of the automobile leads to other changes in America too, beyond the cars themselves. Roads have to improve because they were dirt or wood in many cases to accommodate horse and carriage traffic, but that has to change. You also begin to see traffic signals and road signs and stuff like that to keep people from killing each other all over the road. Cars led to people being able to travel further to work, so they could live further away out in the suburbs, even if there wasn't a streetcar line. Young kids or young adults could, go out and drive to Lover's Lane or go see, films or whatever, and that was much easier with the car. It also, contributes to the advent of things like gas stations, which seems kind of silly, but those are definitely kind of an American thing. The idea of the gas station on the side of the road, and they were full service, and you get your car worked on and get filled up and all that kind of stuff too. So the car creates a major sea change in American culture. In terms of entertainment, the biggest change that happens in America in the 20s is the increased prevalence of the radio. The first commercial radio station was KDKA in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which signed on in 1920, and its inaugural broadcast was the 1920 election returns, where Harding defeated James Cox. Radio could be used to broadcast news. It could be used for drama. This is where the soap opera comes about. These radio programs that were, for the most part, sponsored by soap companies, hence the name. A lot of those made their way to TV in the 1950s, but they started out on radio. Sports events could also be broadcast over the radio as well, especially baseball and boxing, which were the two big sports in the 1920s. Movies saw a big change in the 20s in that they shifted from silent films to talking films. Silent films had been the norm going back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, but the Al Jolson film The Jazz Singer in 1927 was the first film that had synced up sound. And this was a big change because the styles of acting have to change. If you've seen silent films before, the acting is sort of, hammed up and overdone because they're doing more with their bodies than with their mouths, obviously. But so the way movies are made and the style of acting and the way movies look changes fundamentally after that. There still are silent films after 1927. It's not like silent films just stopped. Charlie Chaplin was making silent films into the late 1930s. So they still existed, but it did change, and with that change, a lot of silent film stars' lives and careers were essentially ruined because they didn't make the transition very well. You also, because of the movies and the radio and people, knowing about everything going on in the country, you start to have these national icons, these pop culture figures that pop up, celebrities. And so we'll talk a little bit here about some of those people and who they were. In terms of silent film stars, I mentioned Charlie Chaplin. There's his most iconic character, the little tramp that was in movies throughout the 20s and 30s. Greta Garbo was a big starlet of silent film in the 1920s, and she acted in talking films too, but didn't make the transition incredibly well. She was incredibly beautiful and was, a big sex symbol of the 1920s, if you could call her that. But she wasn't American. She was German, and her voice was sort of gravelly and husky, honestly. And so when people began to hear her on film, it didn't line up with what people had thought of before with her, and she certainly wasn't as big once movies began to have sound in them. As I said, baseball and boxing were the big sports in the 1920s. Babe Ruth was the big baseball star of the 20s. He had played for the Boston Red Sox originally, got traded to the Yankees in 1920, set the record for home runs at the time. He had 714, a record that stood until Hank Aaron broke it in 1974. Go Braves! He's part of the 1927 New York Yankees team that is considered one of the best ever. They were called Murderers Row because of how many good hitters they had. And Babe Ruth was just a celebrity in the way that LeBron is today, honestly. Jack Dempsey was a famous boxer who won several titles throughout the 1920s. And it wasn't all just sports and movies. Charles Lindbergh, possibly the biggest national hero of the 1920s, when in 1927 he flew nonstop from New York all the way to Paris, completing the first solo nonstop transatlantic flight, and became a huge celebrity across the country. And one of the biggest news stories of the 20th century was 1932, when his son was kidnapped from their home in New Jersey and subsequently murdered. And the trial of Bruno Hauptmann, the perpetrator of that crime, became known as the crime of the century because, again, the Lindberghs were so famous. And so that was a big news story at that time. When people think of the Jazz Days, they almost always think about flappers, and so we'll talk a little about women in the 1920s. Women had a lot of momentum, as it were, heading into the Roaring '20s. They had worked outside the home during World War I and gotten a lot of respect as a result of that, which also led to the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. In the 20s, women's votes rarely strayed from their husbands, but still, they had a political voice now, and as a result, were feeling more assertive. Divorce laws were liberalized in many states in the 20s, so they could initiate divorce if a husband was abusive or if they just, didn't want to stay married. Working outside the home became more common for women, at least until they were married. Once they were married, you're not going to see that as much, but it was a lot more common after World War I for women to have jobs. And urban women become a lot more fashionable, and that's the idea of the flapper, which is the picture you see there. That's the dresses hemmed at the knee, the shorter kind of bob haircut. These women are smoking and drinking in public, which before was seen as incredibly taboo. And you notice that it's not a very form-fitting dress, the stereotypical flapper dress. It was sort of tomboyish. It didn't show off a woman's figure at all. It was not considered fashionable for a woman to be voluptuous. She was supposed to sort of be, thin and again, have that sort of boyish figure. And that was sort of how they asserted their equality with men. The 1920s also saw an explosion in culture and literature, a lot of which was social commentary of the time. Some authors, like F. Scott Fitzgerald, were critical of 1920s materialism and sort of the emptiness that people felt. A prime example of that would be Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby, about this guy who has everything and yet is relentlessly unhappy. Ernest Hemingway wrote about World War I, his experiences there, and how it affected the people who fought that conflict. The term lost generation is attributed to both Hemingway and Gertrude Stein. It doesn't mean a group of authors or a group of people who vanished. It's more referring to people who are wandering and aimless and don't know what to do. The lost generation often refers to these authors like Fitzgerald and Hemingway who left America in the 1920s and went to Europe just looking for meaning in many ways and to escape the materialism of the 20s and frankly also to escape Prohibition. Fitzgerald especially just drank like a fish and basically died of alcoholism at a fairly young age. Back home in America, you have a flowering of black culture for the first time in America, and that's the Harlem Renaissance, which took hold obviously in Harlem, which is a notable black neighborhood in New York, but in other major cities as well. And for the first time, you have widely known black singers and authors and intellectuals and people who are able to instill some pride in the African American population. It would be impossible to note every Harlem Renaissance figure. There are entire college classes on the Harlem Renaissance, but here are some of the more notable, well-known ones. On the entertainment side, the famous jazz trumpeter Louis Armstrong, who put out very popular music throughout the early 20th century, as did Ella Fitzgerald, who was a very well-known singer at the time. Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, probably two of the most well-known authors of the Harlem Renaissance. Langston Hughes wrote the poem A Dream Deferred, for instance, which you may have read in your English classes. Zora Neale Hurston, native of Alabama, most known for Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is a notable novel of that time. And then there was an intellectual movement in the Harlem Renaissance as well. You know about W.E.B. Du Bois already, if you're one of my students, who led the NAACP and pushed for social equality for blacks. Marcus Garvey was Jamaican-born but raised in America, and he put forth this movement called Pan-Africanism, which basically meant that everyone of black descent needed to unite and instilled, black nationalism and black pride. And he pushed the Back to Africa movement, trying to get people who were African American to move back to Africa and live there because of discrimination and things that stood in the way of blacks succeeding in America at the time, and that didn't really take off. A few people moved, but not a whole lot. But it did show that African Americans were looking to be considered more socially equal and did work to instill some pride, that people were proud to be African American, and that sort of helped lay the groundwork for civil rights movements, later on in the 20th century. So that will do it for now. Our next video will be much less fun, and it's about the darker side of the 1920s with prohibition and lawlessness and racism and anti-immigrant feelings and all that stuff. So stay tuned for that if you're one of my students, and feel free to post questions in the comment section or ask me in class. Cheers.